Hi, I'm Christine Madera, author of God and Drag, and I'm here with Henry Sullivan, author of Colosseum. And today we are talking about the purpose of work. Now we talk every other Friday about, kind of the things that are coming up and what's going on in the world. And the purpose of work is big because right now there's so many pressures about work and about jobs and about money and AI and all of the threats that jobs and employment are coming from. But from my view, when I introduced this topic and talked to Henry about it, to me, work was the convergence of money and meaning. And if we are disrupting the means of meaning and money together as a system, what else do we do? Like, what other options do we have? Where do we go? And how do we begin to manage this disruption in a way that everybody can thrive and we can continue on without the old stories that we have about work because they're pretty out of date. So, Henry, why don't you, come on in? And what was your first thought when I sent you the topic about the purpose of work?
Well, I thought it's a timely topic, definitely because I think a lot of people are anxious about work. I mean, I see headlines that say things like, "Why are people clinging to jobs they hate?" That's one thing that seems to be very common. And then you see, I've seen a bunch of clips of recent college grads booing these speakers who are obviously there to promote AI, which it almost seems like, why would you agree to do this right now? I mean, what did you expect? Because these AI companies, their offer to the world is, oh, we're creating a technology that will replace you, and so the companies won't have to hire you or anybody else. So, aren't you excited?
But their original thing, like, if you go back and you listen to these guys, Sam Altman and Elon Musk and all that, it's like we're creating a future where we won't need to work, where everybody and they're like what they talked about before now, where it's kind of the rubber hitting the road, was we're gonna have this era in which people will have to work a lot less and maybe not have much more leisure time, and everybody's gonna have, the food that they need, and we're gonna have everything run by AI and all this automation, and it's gonna be like the Jetsons, like it's gonna be wonderful. And then now when it comes and at the time, and even still, they're saying you need to tax AI in a new way. Like you need to be able to use some of this technology to help improve lives, but we're still operating in this old story of like, yeah, when you have the means of productivity, then the people who own the means get the rewards, and the people who are now less productive because they're people and they need to, not only have paycheck but healthcare and all this other kind of stuff like that's non-productive, and so we get rid of those people. So all the promise that we had with AI, now it's like, well, yeah, now we're just laying people off, and now it's somebody else's problem to try to figure out how we, be sure that people have, a way to live. And so there's all this work about, oh, they'll just retrain because that never works or rarely works, especially with older people, or UBI, which has its own problems, or, all these other things that either strip away the meaning and the dignity around work, or that we've infused with work, because we can get, dignity and meaning and contribution in lots of ways. We've just kind of attached it to work because, as Americans in particular, we're expected to spend so much of our time working. It has to be, it has to do a lot of things, has to carry a lot of weight. So it carries the stories of being a valid person, of being legitimate, of having meaning and contribution, and, all of these different things, as opposed to just being a paycheck. But when you have a disruption like this and nobody is really willing to look at what needs to be done to manage that, the disruption of not only money and meaning, but like how do we recreate that society that they're talking about, where we work less and we have what we need and we have, thriving lives, and AI is a benefit to everybody as opposed to a benefit to some and a job destroyer of the many, which kind of seems like our default mode right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to kind of zero in on one thing you mentioned, universal basic income, the
Hmm.
UBI. And so it's an interesting idea. It's not like it's never been done anywhere
Yeah.
because my understanding is people in Alaska get a check every year
Yeah.
based on, I mean,
Based
if
on
you're a
oil.
resident of Alaska, you know.
Hmm.
And so I'm kind of curious because I guess one thing that you're implying is what Sherrod Brown calls the dignity of work. It's kind of like how you have people who this idea of, well, I mean, I enjoy gardening, and so I go out, because I want to go out and work in the garden every day, and it just, that working with my hands, being outside, producing something that will be beautiful, being connected to nature, all that stuff gives me, like
Hmm.
you said, me.
Great pleasure. Meaning, yes.
And so one way you can interpret this whole thing about, well, you won't have to work because, we have these agents that will do a lot of the kind of jobs that the kind of job that you have. And so it's almost like implying, well, you can garden all day now, but the question is like you said, I mean, this is the United States of America, and it's not like all of a sudden we're going to go from being a socialism for billionaires and corporations to socialism for actual human beings. It's just hard to imagine that in
Yeah,
America.
that's not gonna happen. Right. And so much of
So,
the story about, like, the dignity of work that you were talking about is I
mhm,
think that's a story that a lot of us have internalized for those of us who actually have to work. But when you think about, like, work and people talk about, the value of work and all of these different things, to me, that's always been a euphemism for the value of having money because we sort of give that, the dignity of work. You're digging ditches, you're doing all this stuff. You've got this dignity. Maybe you don't make enough to, afford a vacation every year, but you've got this dignity. But it's really, if for people who've never had to work or who, there's a big movement with young people in the tech business now to, that even if they're making great money, they live 3 or 4 to an apartment. It's all about saving money and building up their investment accounts because they see the writing on the wall that those jobs are going away, and they
mhm.
need to have the money to survive to have the lifestyle that they want. And so to me, it's always been about, the dignity of having money because if when people have either make a lot of money and live off their investments or who have never had to work because they've inherited their money, like nobody calls them freeloaders. Nobody says that they don't have dignity. Nobody says that they don't have value because they're not contributing in different ways. So the dignity of work and the work ethic is for those of us who actually have to, earn a paycheck in order to live. And people who are living off wealth, like they have a different criteria because they have money. So they're okay. They're fine the way that they are. There's like this dual thing that it's always about having the money versus doing the work. If you think about like old England, and not even that old, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, work was something that if you were an aristocrat, that was a dirty word. You didn't do it. Like you know, for somebody to suggest that you were working was really like saying something bad about you because you were supposed to be living this life of leisure and living off of your investments and managing your estates and all this kind of stuff. So work has always been about those of us who need to work for the money to live and those of us with wealth, those people with wealth, not those of us with wealth, but those people with wealth have a different set of criteria applied to them, that which is the dignity of having a lot of money.
Well, I mean, it's I'm kind of smiling because I remember the first time I encountered the word. I'm going to mispronounce it because it's a French word, ennui.
Mm, mhm,
And I'm trying to remember the novel that it's a classic novel where at the end of the novel the woman sort of walks into the waves. It is set in Louisiana, and she doesn't actually live in New Orleans. She lives
mhm,
outside of New Orleans, but she's suffering from ennui because her husband is wealthy, but she doesn't love him.
uh-huh,
But she's married to him because it's sort of a thing that she sort of had to do. Is it? societally she didn't have she was compelled to do it, let's put it like that.
Yeah.
And so that's the reason why like the ending is so is sort of a representation of how her way of taking control of her life by ending it. She literally just walks into the water. And so
Mhm.
it took me a while to understand that concept. I was just like, wait a second, what exactly does this mean? You know, she's how is this suffering? Because the word, you know, included in it is that you don't have any weight. It's like a weightlessness. You don't have
Mm.
any problems or the stress of money concerns and all this other kind of stuff.
Right.
And I think the dignity of work idea, because I agree with you in a way, it's almost like it's I mean, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but it's like you're trying to sell people on a particular
Right.
idea, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And in part of that, you're also sort of trying to recognize how people feel. I mean, this is a politician running for office, you know, but I also think that like there's almost like a reflection of that, you know, you're almost giving people the opportunity to look down on that person with money who has no life and no meaning in their life and all this other kind of stuff. But I sort of agree with you that, you know, if you don't have to worry about money, that frees you up to do a whole lot of other things, you know, so you can actually choose
Mhm.
to create, you can choose to build, you can choose to travel, you can choose to experience and explore, you know, but I guess going back to this what the state that we're in right now, we're not actually being offered that actually.
No.
You know, so and I think that that makes it makes it a worthwhile conversation is we know that I mean there is a fight. People are fighting this AI thing, and you know there seems to be the most agreement on data centers. Like there's a
Yeah, I think
lot
that's a
of
target you can easily data center or no data center is an easy way to fight AI versus the whole conceptual idea of, the gamut of what it is.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the technology's there, and like you know, who knows how many people know how to build it. It's just that you know the barrier to entry. The data centers are the barrier of entry to entry because you need so much compute power
Mhm.
to make it
And electrical
happen,
power
and electrical power and water.
and
You
water.
know, and so yeah, so that seems to be the thing that everybody that has the most agreement in terms of opposition because it's
Mhm.
a big, physical, ugly, you know, water consuming, you know, power draining thing that they're sort of trying to sneak into communities without them knowing.
Yeah, but, I don't think I mean, and it's valid, and I understand. I don't want a power center right by me, and they're supposed to raise the temperature around you. I mean, there's all kinds of negative things about these power centers, but, targeting the power center is kind of this substitute and this attempt to hold on to something that's already crumbling. Like, there's so many other ways that jobs and employment are being stressed. We've got the aging population, younger population, like a much smaller younger population to support a much higher aging population. We've got all kinds of stresses on, and we've got people entering into jobs where they're making money, but they still can't afford like the basic things in life, and all kinds of things. And retirees coming through that are retiring based on what would have been okay, but now as inflation continues to rise, things are
Mhm.
becoming more unaffordable, so people are staying in their jobs longer. There's all kinds of stress around jobs, but I think the data center thing was not against stopping the data centers because then it forces a conversation about what do we use AI for and how do we do it. But I think it's kind of a substitute for having the actual conversation because AI has already disrupted so many things. And so how do we actually look at a functioning society and world in which AI is a factor? Because I don't think it's going away, even if there's not many data centers being built, the trajectory is already there. And so how do we either force the conversation or have the conversation about, what do people do in society to have meaning and to be connected to like gardening and stuff like you're saying, which is great. But then if you were like, great, I'm gonna garden, but then like how do you make your money? How do you earn the money or whatever, get the money to buy the seeds and the stuff that you need to garden and
Or
to
the
have
house,
the
or the
electricity
house.
and the house? and all that stuff, and we've just tied everything to employment. We've made it the meaning structure. We've made it the legitimate person, responsible person structure. We've made it your access to healthcare. We have made it your access to a reasonable retirement. Like we have put everything on this work, and there's no conversation about how we continue to have a thriving society, because that's breaking down as well as more people are pushed downward and some people are pushed upward, and the middle class is kind of disintegrating and being squeezed out, without really having some kind of a revolution where we, take to the streets. I mean, it's just the unwillingness to think about what the next step might be and how we might get there and how we make AI part of the process, because I don't think we can discount it at this point.
Well, I actually think there are groups of people who are thinking about these things. And every now and then I run across a video where it's one of those things where, because, I used to only see what was discussed in the Center for Strategic Studies and stuff like that when someone who attended the conference will then do an interview on television. Whereas now, because
Mhm.
of this technology, it's not crazy to see like an actual broadcast of the actual conference. And people will discuss stuff like this. Just another thing I'm going to sort of zoom in on. One of the things that you said is you have an aging population, and then you have fewer people having children. So it looks as if who's going to take care of those older people? I actually think, I mean, and this may sound terrible, but I actually think that robotics will get to the point where when that becomes starts to become an issue, if you can afford it, robots are
Mhm.
going to take care of the elderly.
Well, yeah, if you could afford it. That's the thing. But we're
Well,
not
that's already true now, though. If you That's
yeah,
already
well,
true
they're doing
now.
that in Japan, but yeah, and that is true. Everything is about that, is having money,
If you can afford it.
be able to
Exactly,
afford
exactly.
what you could do now. But there's not on a and I when I'm saying people aren't having a conversation, I mean people like you and I, there's policy people that or there's not policy people, but there's different organizations and groups that are talking about this, but we're not having conversations at the policy levels for things to begin to get implemented. So political levels, social levels, or the mechanism of the economy, like things are it's kind of just like, well, we socialize the wealthy and we socialize corporations because if they fail, big problems happen. But if individuals fail, well, no big deal. It's okay.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so, the risk, is the rugged individualism is that we all take on the risk of all of these changes without any, any security to be able to help us through that transition. And so when I'm saying the conversation, I really mean the conversation at the political level.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. Well, I mean, as you might imagine, I expect a revolution. I mean,
I know you do.
I totally expect a revolution. So, but it sounds almost like what you're saying is instead of the disruption of a social revolution, can't we just sort of discuss this and come up with a reasonable plan?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's a great
It's like
idea.
pie in the sky way of wanting to not have to not go through the whole revolution because, that has its own serious problems. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot of blowback on that and there's yeah. So, I like to imagine that we could be adults for a little while and think about, we've got this stuff coming down the pike. How do we actually manage that? Because even some of the big tech people are saying a little bit through the side of their mouth, yeah, we can kind of see how maybe we need to tax this stuff so that we can distribute the benefits of it more evenly so that people aren't disrupted, into oblivion. But then they don't ever really want to be taxed anyway. So there's this dual thing because we have this as in America, taxes is part of our origin story. We hate taxes and we fought a war over taxes, which was not entirely true. But that's part of our origin story is, we don't want to be taxed. We don't want unfair taxes. And that continues all the way up to, the corporate level. But if you think about how to have a society that is stable and functional so that corporations and everybody else can function. I mean, if the society becomes dysfunctional or unfunctional, the corporations aren't going to have anything either. So it's not like, you
Well,
know,
that's kind of an interesting thing because, I do actually one form of novel that I really like sometimes is historical fiction, sometimes it's speculative fiction, but one form of novel that I really like is a novel that where part of the storyline is societal collapse is in the process. And so
hmm
societal collapse is one of the challenges that the main character or characters are dealing with. How am I
hmm
dealing with society as it's coming down? And one thing that
yeah,
surprises me as we go through, because we've already experienced the revolution. We just experienced a Christian nationalist revolution. I
right.
mean,
Yeah.
that's just a fact. And the thing that's strange about that is how I assumed that it would be much more day to day, that there would be much more day to day disruption. But the
hmm
disruption it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. So, like, as part of this Christian nationalist revolution that we have, well, I mean, if you're in Texas and your doctor says that, your pregnancy is having problems and your choice is either you abort, the baby who might actually be, deceased already and you're
hmm
sad and everything, but, you need to abort the fetus or you die.
Right.
If you're in Texas,
You
then
die.
that Christian nationalist revolution has really had a big impact on
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. You
But
die.
if you don't live in Texas, then it's just a decision between you and your doctor.
hmm
So it's just interesting to me. And I traveled. I did a not exactly across the country kind of thing, but I did drive during the holidays.
hmm
Across several states, and I was really kind of struck by how because I listen to audiobooks while I'm doing cross country driving, and so the normal news I wasn't paying any attention, and then you're just sort of interacting with people that
Yeah.
have never met before, never will meet before, like in restaurants and gas station. You stop, you get coffee or whatever, and it really is amazing how if you didn't know that we were at war, or if you didn't know that the Supreme Court has gutted voting rights or made it legal for the president to do whatever he or she wants to do. If you
Yeah.
didn't know that, you wouldn't necessarily, have any reason to know that. Like there's nothing forcing you to be aware of those things. And this was at the time when ICE was in certain places,
Mhm.
literally killing people in broad
Yeah.
daylight, whereas they weren't where I was, and I drove through several states.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's like
Yeah,
you
that
didn't.
impeachment style revolution is actually much more effective in many ways than a street fighting revolution.
Right.
Be
Well, the US is so big that it's
Yeah.
possible for like major things to be happening in one part of the country and the rest of the country, unless they're paying attention, it's just like, I mean, how many people are aware that there's a UFC fight scheduled on Sunday in front of the White House?
I don't
How many
know,
people are aware
but
of
I'm
that?
sure there'll be a lot of people watching. Yeah, yeah, I
We'll
don't I
see.
don't know. It's you're right. And so but because a lot of those things are slow moving, but then once they get in place, like, like the voting rights thing, like, the what the Supreme Court said, and then the effects of that are distant from one another. So it's not like the Supreme Court said this, and then all of a sudden,
You
we
lose. Yeah,
have
you can't do
the
stuff.
result
Yeah,
of that.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly,
So
exactly.
it takes people by surprise, and then, it's kinda too late to deal with it. It was like the, Citizens United, it was like, well, they make this one particular choice that corporations are people and that there's unlimited money in politics is okay and all of this stuff, and then, as you move down the line, you see the corrosive nature of that kind of money in politics, but, you don't see it right up front, and, so I think these kind of slow-moving revolutions, kind of lawfare revolutions are probably much more effective in the US than a street-by-street revolution. Because 'cause I'd always wondered, they were saying, "Oh, we're gonna go to civil war." I'm like, "I don't really think it's gonna work like the last one." Like, I just didn't know, and these are the guys with the guns. I'm like, "Who are you gonna go to war against? Like, your neighbor? Like, how is that gonna work?" But it's this kind what you're talking about, like, that kind of encroachment lawfare revolution that is, happening that we just it's kind of happening in front of our eyes, and there's really not much that we're able to do about it.
Well, I mean, I just need to point out the Confederates weren't able to storm the Capitol during the Civil War.
No,
Whereas
but they had on the
on
field,
January
they
6th,
had, like you had the guys in the gray and the guys in the
I
blue,
hear what
and,
you're saying. I hear what
they
you're
yeah,
saying,
but
but a Confederate flag did not fly in the Capitol until January
no.
6th.
Yeah,
You
no,
know,
I agree with you on that one, but that was, like,
yeah,
one small thing there. It's not like, when you think of war, like, when I think of a war, although I've been watching some stuff, like, on the American Revolution, and it's interesting because you have, like, the camp over here and the camp over here, and then they decide to come here and fight, and I'm like,
yeah,
"Okay."
that does seem strange, doesn't it?
And the Civil War, similar, it's like, "We're gonna meet on this battlefield, and we're gonna kill each other," and I'm like, "Okay, that just seems so weird."
Yeah, well, we don't fight wars like that. But one thing that struck me reading again historical fiction, one is I think the authors who write this stuff are accurate in the sense that if you think about a society where if you don't protect yourself, you have no way of knowing because there's no telecommunications, there's no internet. So out of the blue, from your perspective, a band of people can come into your community, kill a bunch of you, take your land, take a bunch of you into into slavery,
Mhm.
and then just keep going and claim
Yeah,
and put their flag in front of it. So you have to have some kind of protection. You have castles and moats and
yeah.
and all this other kind of stuff. And like the men spent from early age, they spent their whole lives, particularly in certain classes of this society, just basically training on how to fight. And so that was the way that you had honor, kind of bringing this back to the whole idea of work.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
like the
of work,
work
yeah.
that they did was
Mhm,
they became really good fighters. And, I think
mhm,
I mentioned, I couldn't remember what country it was, but I do distinctly remember this video where, like how they have the announcer and they're like, and the leader of such and such a country met Vladimir Putin and he's walking through all these halls and whatnot. And the guy is just huge. And that really reminded me of like a lot of whenever in historical fiction novels, when you go back far enough, when they describe the
mhm.
king is usually this huge guy, because he's the one who people, the other guys will respect,
Right? Yeah.
and he's right there in the middle of it in that battle, like you said, where they kind of meet on the field and they just run right into each other. But one thing that these authors sort of portray is like the boys look forward to that. So the thing that
Mhm.
kind of sounds crazy, it's like, well, why would you want to? I mean, why would you fight that way if you know that they're going to come looking for a group of guys, in a specific place? Why don't you surround them or do something unexpected, right?
Well,
Well,
there
that's
was
the
the
way.
honor.
Well,
It was the
exactly. There was the
honorable way
honor.
to fight, like, you had
Exactly. That
the
was the honorable
prescribed
way to
way of
fight.
fighting, and, like, even in the American Revolution, there was the prescribed way of fighting, but, I mean, that was one of, an earlier guerrilla war, like, the Continentals or whatever they called them, were also did a lot of ambushing, which was
Hmm.
how they were able to stop British, supply lines and different kinds of things. So anyway, but
Right.
coming
Right.
back to work, because your lawfare thing, like the way that works now for work is, I mean, what's happening now is almost the opposite of that. That there's without any laws or direction or ways of my internet may be going, but or ways of looking at how we support people through this process, it becomes a free for all. And so, having some ideas now on from a policy level to put in so that, down the line we have more of a safety net can be helpful. But right now it's kind of like, well, everybody will just it's every person for themselves. So it's kind of the opposite of that lawfare where they're trying to change the laws to, help some people and harm other people.
I understand why you're saying that, but again, it was so eye-opening going from state to state and actually living in different states because it really does feel to me like I mean, safety net is one way to say it. It's just that there are more ways, how can I put it? It's like you don't necessarily have to fall as hard when you hit hard times, depending on what state you're in. It seems like in
Mhm.
some
Yeah,
states,
it's very different
if
state to state.
yeah, in some states, if you hit hard times, that's it. I mean, you are just
Mhm.
screwed.
A lot of the
And
South
you
is, yeah, like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but states all around the country are at will states. And I mean, I know
Mhm.
if we have, foreign viewers, that term is intentionally deceptive. What it
Yeah,
actually means is you can be fired for any reason.
yeah.
That's what at will means. So of course, I mean, you can quit anytime you want, but that's the least likely thing to happen. The more likely thing to happen is you'll get fired. It is legal to fire you basically for any reason in most states in the United States. They're at will states. And so I agree with you that there needs to be some discussion, although I remember distinctly when there was an expectation that policies last year were going to cause, collapse and, huge layoffs and stuff like that. That's when universal basic income was like, oh, well, maybe we can just ship out some checks like we did during COVID.
Yeah, but
And
that's not a
people,
really great
oh,
solution.
no, it's not a long-term solution. I totally agree with you. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that,
And it's
that
not a very well thought out solution because if you looked at what
no.
happened in COVID, they sent people money which helped. I mean, it was like triage. You were seeing where all the bleeding was. The money was stop the bleeding so that people could live while things were locked down. And then afterward, we had all this inflation because there was all this money out there that had been distributed, and then the bill came due, and then we had to increase interest rates to manage the inflation, and that makes the cost of paying that money back, in terms of treasury bills and stuff, more expensive, and we fared better than many places, but that was still. People talk about OUBI, and I'm like, well, it's great on small scale because if you introduce some money into a system where basically everything else is the same, then that can help some people get things that they didn't get before. But if you introduce a lot of money into a system, but there's not new housing, there's not, a look at the food supply and like how do we be sure that there's enough food supply so that people can get what they want, then you just have higher prices for the same things. And then it costs like, it could just cost more money. You have more money, but you still can't afford life. Because before COVID, $15 an hour was this aspirational wage. And now
Mhm.
$15 an hour, like, that's a no-brainer, right? $15 an hour at McDonald's, basically.
Right.
But things are less affordable now than they were before COVID because even though the money amount that people have made has shifted. But there has been some talk, and like, I'm a big fan of this, and in my novel that is not out yet, but what young adult novel, I talked about universal basic standard of living, and it was really about separating survival from work. So that the benefit of basically general productivity went so that people had healthcare, they had education, they had electricity, they had the data that they need. They had the basics of life as a floor. So there was a universal floor of a standard of living. And then, you had money and other things for the more enjoyable things in life. Like if you wanted to travel, if you wanted to do, if you wanted a bigger house, if you want more things, if you want, more comforts, then of course you have money to be able to buy those things, but you don't, like, your basic security is not tied to a job because then, like, if you lose your job here, if you, and especially if you lose a job and you're living paycheck to paycheck, your basic security is shot. You've got maybe a month or two of rent or paying your mortgage or paying your car payment or these things before everything starts to be stripped away. But is that really helpful? Because unemployment insurance doesn't really cover that stuff. It covers a percentage. Like in some places, it covers like 10%. And some places it's more like 40 or 50, but it's usually not enough to cover like your whole nut. And so, but if you have this universal basic standard, then you've got a floor in which if you are fired or if you decide you want to, spend some time to retrain for something else, you don't lose everything in the process. You're not tied to a job because, like I know it was a friend of mine who couldn't change jobs, couldn't leave his job because he had a a medically special need child. And you had to, at that point in time, like, not just interview for a job, you had to interview for the insurance coverage for that job. And if the insurance company decided they were not going to cover a expensive child because that child had lots of special needs, you would be might be able to get the job, but because you couldn't get the insurance coverage, you couldn't get the job. So it ties people in ways that is actually non-productive for people and society generally speaking. So I'm a big fan of that universal floor, and then we can rise from the universal floor. So
Well, what's the difference between that and I mean, I've never lived in France or Germany or the UK, but what is the difference between that and countries in Europe? Isn't that
I
what they
don't know.
have?
I don't know. I mean, they've got certainly more of that than we do, but I don't know. I don't know how it works in those countries, and I'm sure it's different country to country.
Mhm.
Once you're in that system, you've got different levels of support in that system. But I don't know if that's like a guaranteed floor or if it's like different kinds of safety nets that help people, maintain a particular kind of standard.
Yeah, because I mean, I never really bought the whole idea that, that Europe is in decline or stagnant because they're too generous to their citizens. But then it was sort of I mean, I don't agree with all of this, we're just gonna remove our troops from Europe and you're on your own and you should pay for your own. But at the same time, I've seen videos on DW and on France 24 where they're actually interviewing citizens in Germany and other countries, and they're just like, "Well, I don't think we necessarily need to spend so much money on defense." And I'm just like, "Wait, you actually think that now?"
Right.
It's like, I mean, I can understand, like in the US, we
Mhm.
have two docile neighbors,
Right.
I mean, compared to us,
Yeah.
I mean, and
Yeah,
so and
absolutely.
so, I mean, we don't really worry about Canada or Mexico invading us, whereas they actually have a country that invaded a country that's not that far from where they are. And you have, and you're just like, oh, I don't feel like, we should spend all this money on defense. So that kind of goes back to what I was saying about these historical fiction novels. It's like, well, if you don't, you might.
Well, but they've never had like, to them, the status quo is that we have troops there to help, and so they've never really recently, like, we're all on different sort of levels of this, but like, in the United States, we've not dealt with fascism here, so we're looking at the things and saying, oh yeah, this it can't happen here.
Right,
Where in
right.
Europe,
So it's right there in our face, and we don't know. We're not reacting to it because
yeah,
we've never. Yeah, I know what you're
but
saying. Yeah,
there we've
although we
had.
did have Jim Crow. I mean, what's the difference between fascism and Jim Crow?
Right, but that in historical memory, for most people, Jim Crow, is not something that has been a recent historical thing enough for people to it be part of their personal experience. Just like for younger people now, World War II is not part of their family historical or their recent historical experience. Like when I was growing up, I knew people who'd been in World War II and who'd survived World War II and all this stuff. Didn't really know anybody from World War One. So that to me was like a war that was in the history. But World War II was sort of recent history, and then now we're many many decades past that, and so you get that much more removed from people's personal experience.
Well, I
But
should
in
say though, I do know people who couldn't drink out of certain water
sure,
fountains. Yeah, I
but
do
in
know
terms
people
of
who
the
lived through that.
I imagine you do, but in terms of the larger, like, we know that that was a something that happened, but in most people's experience, that was the past because then we had civil rights, and now that's not the situation. So in Europe, they had a world war, and then they have this period of peace, and the US is in there with a lot of different bases kind of enforcing peace so they don't have to worry about, defense as much. So people who didn't have that war as part of their personal experience or memory, like, they're thinking, well, there's no problem because we haven't experienced a problem.
Hmm.
It's kinda like if it's not, if we haven't experienced the problem doesn't exist. It's like that Citizens United. You didn't see the effects of that until that actually was decided, because then when it was decided, it seemed like, well, yeah, okay, kind of makes sense that corporations are people and, they can contribute money as well. It didn't seem like that was that big of a deal. But then, the movement forward about what that meant is an issue. So if you've got people in France saying we don't need to spend money on defense, Russia's here, as Russia continues to move toward France, they might decide that they do need to
Yeah, I
spend
guess
more.
that's where we're different because to me, I mean, and actually Citizens United said that money is speech.
Yeah.
And so I mean the whole corporations is people, that was way before Citizens
Was it?
United.
Okay. Got 'em all confused.
Yeah, it really was way before. I mean, in both ideas, corporations are people and money is speech. Both those ideas are just abhorrent to me.
Yeah.
But uh but you're right, it's not the sense that's not the case for most people. I guess my thing is I to your point about planning for changes, technological changes, environmental changes, and all sorts of changes. And it does make more sense to do that. There is a country that did that, and that country is China. They did plan, but at the same, but we're Americans, and so we're talking in terms of being able to say whatever we want to say, and we're talking about Germany as if we're an expert, and talking about France as if we know what
Right,
we're
right,
talking about.
right.
Whereas you can't really do that in China. You got to watch what you say. So yeah, I guess it would be nice if there were more. And I really do. I get the impression, depending on the media you consume, that conversations are being had. The problem right now, though, is yes, these are big problems, but so much has
Mhm.
gone wrong that we have so many problems. I mean, it's not like when you stop talking about climate change that the climate ceases to be a problem. And then
Right.
because we have a super El Nino coming our way. I think they call it the Godzilla El Nino or something like that. And so and it's they know it's going to be the impact on weather patterns is going to be intense, but they don't exactly know exactly what's going to happen and where it's going to happen. But when those things happen, then people will talk less about like what we're talking about here, which is jobs and artificial intelligence and data centers and whatnot and stuff like that. But it's not like those things are no longer a problem. They're a problem too. And so I think one challenge is that we have the data center problem, the job disruption problem. We have really high gas prices. We've got like climate, the changing climate with unpredictable weather patterns.
Yep.
I mean, we just have so many problems with people aren't having as many kids as they used to have. And we're going to have an aging population. By the way, I kind of heard though an interesting thing that kind of goes to what we were talking about on Sunday with regard to the ethical
Digital nomad.
travel.
Yeah.
Yeah, the digital nomad is this issue of population growth isn't as bad in places like Kenya
No,
and
it's not.
Rwanda
Yeah.
and so on. And, this one guy, I forget exactly what his specialization is. He's a scholar in some area that you don't normally hear about. And he was saying, if you look at the data related to this, it's actually very clear that when you have countries that have really large young populations,
Mhm.
and then a couple of other things need to be true as well. Those countries tend to do much better than other countries because they have the energy and the
Right.
vibrancy to actually
Mhm.
do it. And like those are some of the countries that are going to be in that position when other parts of the world are not. Even though, like
Yes.
I said, I really do believe, though, I agree with the vibrancy point, but in terms of taking care of the elderly, I think we're
Mhm.
only about 5 years away before you can buy a robot to do that for you.
Oh, yeah, they have them in Japan already. I mean, because
Yeah,
they're way ahead
exactly.
of us in that. So
Exactly. And
so they're doing those.
China's definitely, yeah.
Yeah, but to bring it back to sort of, the job question and the meaning question and the ability to have a conversation about a looming problem versus waiting for it to become an immediate problem. We're not very good at that. If you think about like the housing crisis in 2008, there were a lot of signs and people were saying we need to change these things. Well, oh no, but people are making money, it's great. And then everything crashes, and then there's laws that react to that. And then things are stable for a while because of those laws. And it's like, well, it's kind of like that people in France thinking they don't need to spend money on defense. Well, everything's fine now. So now we don't need those laws. Like, we don't need the laws that kept things being fine. Now we can take those away because everything's fine. But as soon as you take those, like the Frank Dodd laws away, then all of a sudden you're going to be back in those financial bubbles and problems that they had. So I think it was Frank Dodd. I don't know. I get those confused. But, we're not very good we're much more prone to react to a crisis in motion than we are to thoughtfully think about, how might we manage this going forward. And I think China takes like that extreme route, and they've got major problems in China
Oh, yeah,
as
yeah,
well
yeah,
that,
housing market, yeah, yeah, they've got I
yeah, the
mean, and they
housing
also
market,
well,
not they don't have jobs for young
they have the
people
one-child
anymore.
policy, so they have the the population issue as well, so
Well, they do, but then they also have a huge unemployment issue for young people.
that's true, yeah, they do have
So,
that, that's true.
I mean, a huge unemployment issue for young people, and the same thing, that unaffordability, all that kind of stuff is happening in China as well, even though they've
Mhm,
planned for things, but they didn't plan. They planned for societal structure and that kind of stuff, but they did it the Chinese way. But to not have any kind of thought process about how, like even right now, the looming problem for many people right now are kids graduating from college with no jobs.
mhm,
Right? So, ideally, they have parents they can stay with, they can tell they can find something or go back to school. I mean, a lot of kids during COVID, there wasn't jobs when they were graduating from college, so they stayed in school, they got their master's degrees, they got their doctorate degrees. Graduating now, still not really much of a job market, and it's kinda like, well, that's kind of their problem, and they just need to retrain. Now they just need to go work, building or putting solar panels on houses, or they need to become a plumber or something like that, and, there's just not any way to look at this from or anybody who's looking at this from a societal, and I mean anybody by, politics and those kind of things and policy level, looking at this from a societal level. They kinda make it a personal problem
well,
versus a s
or another way to look at it is we're just making it up as we go along,
yeah.
but
But
I
they're
think
not
you
even
kinda
making it up. They're just like, "Well, that's their problem." That's you don't have a job, that's your problem. And so you must not be productive enough. You must not want it hard enough. You must not work hard enough. You might not be a good person because if you don't have a job in our dignity language, then you must not be worthy in one way or another.
mhm,
Versus, the fact that structurally we are in a place where there just are not jobs for people.
mm,
And we're not looking at that from a structural issue. That when you've got all of these people and you have this many people and you have this many jobs and you have people who need to work 2 and 3 jobs just to live, so they're taking up more jobs. Then from a structural standpoint, you have a problem. But
mhm,
we haven't made it a structural issue yet. We have made it a personal issue and a personal problem.
yeah,
And to
that's
me,
true.
that is the big problem.
Well, yeah, yeah, but I mean, we don't really operate in a society, and it's one thing. I was struck I started to notice or think about all the way back in I don't know 2008 or so is how rarely you hear the word countryman. You don't hear that word in the United States of America that often because
Mhm,
citizenship in the United States of America does not really come with the notion of countryman.
mhm,
Citizenship, in the US is a thing that you have.
yeah,
Is very much like we've been talking about graduating from college. And again, going back to historical fiction novels that I've read, like The Name of the Rose and Sid Arthur and stuff like that, it's very clear in those novels that knowledge is a communal thing. Very
mhm,
clear.
yeah,
I mean, they literally will talk about, well, I studied with the such and such in this particular place, and well, you are you're a Franciscan or you're, a Jesuit and all this kind of stuff. And so you're part of a community, so that your knowledge isn't something that a little piece of paper that you walk around with and say, I've got this now,
yeah,
so admit me into this corporation or whatever. It really is, is a recognition that is tied to, the class that you were part of and the teachers that taught you and that school's pedagogy and their approach to education and learning and is connected to all those things. And we kind of do the same thing with citizenship where it's literally my thing.
Yeah.
and it's kind of the thing I walk around with, where it's like I have the right to do this because I'm a citizen, as opposed to being part of a community. And the thing about that is it's sort of like the whole that you characterize people not having children as much as in the past as a problem, but that's not a problem. You can't force people to have children. It's like
No,
if people aren't having children, I mean, there are a lot of reasons for it, but like you can't really do anything to change that. And countries are
no.
trying and they're
They've tried
failing.
it, and it's not really working, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really working. It's not something you can throw money at. It's not something you can sort of talk to people about. I mean, it's like, it's just a way, it's something you don't have to deal with. And it's kind of like the same thing with that issue, because I agree with you. The fact that American citizenship does not include the notion of countrymen is a big part of why we have all these other problems. But
Yeah.
the thing is that's American citizenship. I mean, that's the way our society is. And, we need to change. That needs to change. And I don't know if you can change that any more than you can encourage people to have children. I don't know that it can be done, to tell you the
I think
truth.
those are kind of, I mean, I won't say they're directly intertwined, but I think one thing that people are craving that we used to have more of is community. And we used to have more local community, we had more work community, we had more the ideas of
Mm,
community.
yeah,
And people felt like, and even, people didn't used to move as far away from their families as they did. So you had family community, you had all this other kinds of built-in sort of community. We had civic organizations, Rotary and Kiwanis and some of these other things that have had heydays and have kind of dwindled down. So there's not as much sense of community, and we don't have much of a sense of community nationally. But one of the things I think that is hard for people when they're raising children, because the whole, nuclear family is an invention, basically,
right.
because it used to be a community. You raised people you had your children, but you lived in a community and everybody was kind of watching everybody else's kids. And, you had multiple generations, you had all of these things. And now it's like,
It
you're on your own.
it takes a
And
village.
so,
It takes a village. Yeah, I
yeah,
know.
it
I
does
know what
take
you
a
mean.
village,
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah.
there's a lot of things that take a village, caring for parents can take a village. I mean, a lot of people that I know, including myself, have elderly family and parents, and, it takes a village to support somebody who's aging. So it takes a village for a lot of things. But because we don't have that and we don't have much in the way of like a path forward for people to know that their kids will be coming into a society where they're going to have some care around that. Where they're going to be in a caring society, where they're going to have community, where they're going to have stability, where they're going to have opportunity. That's just one more layer of reasons why people are not having kids. I mean, a lot of the not having kids are accidental kids, because that's, they keep saying that's what most of this is, are unwed parents and oops babies, because there's so much better contraception and things and family planning and things like that. So there's not as many oops babies, but even families who want children aren't having as many as they want. And in part because there's not the there's never a guarantee, but there's not even really lip service to a guarantee that their children will have a better life than they have.
Well, a couple of things to the "oops babies" thing. I think the reason why this is all such an alarming topic is because researchers, right after they say that people aren't having as many children anymore, they're actually saying our studies are showing that people aren't having sex.
Yeah, well,
So
that's
it's
yeah.
not that there isn't any that's right. There isn't any opportunity for an
Right.
oops, baby. But I heard a very interesting conversation on YouTube where one of the people pointed out that the basically what she was saying is that the American dream was a very powerful aspirational motivation for people, and even if you didn't achieve the American dream, it sort of gave you a reason to have a stake in the success of the country, and it gave you something to fight for. So the whole feeling that like the country, you're losing the country or whatever, well, you're going to fight for, you're much more likely to demonstrate against a war that you feel like is destroying the country, or demonstrate against, a Supreme Court decision that you think is destroying the country. And we talked about how where's the music? This doesn't seem to be any kind of liberation, freedom, any kind of social opposition music out there. Well, the other thing that she pointed out, which is very much true, and you kind of put your finger on it a second ago when you were talking about how, you talked about, well, if you bring a child into the world today, is this a compassionate country? Is this, what kind of treatment will they have? I mean, like, when you bring them to school, one of the first things they're going to have to be taught is what to do if the mean person comes to the school wanting to kill everybody. That's one
Yeah,
of the first things they're going to
right.
have to be taught.
Yeah,
And so, when you start kind of really putting all of the puzzle pieces together of what life in America actually is like, the things that you actually have to do, it's just like I mean, you'd have to be crazy to think that that you bringing someone into a pleasant place. I mean, that's a crazy idea. Nobody
yeah.
thinks that.
No, we live in
You
a
bring
very
you
adversarial society, and, like,
very
everything's set
adversarial.
up that way, and it's exhausting to be in an adversarial society.
That's right. It's very negative. It's like you actually have people arguing that compassion is a bad thing. And some of these people are in power. And, I mean, and so it's not, it kind of makes sense that people, I mean, they're not having sex, but even if they were, they wouldn't necessarily choose to have children.
Right.
Which is kind of ironic. I mean, just as an aside, and I just can't help but say it. We have undergone a Christian national revolution, and one of the things that they want is for people to have more children. But they've created such a negative, dispiriting
Yeah.
society. Like this revolution has resulted in such a negative, dispiriting, exhausting kind of place that nobody wants to have children in a
No,
world
and
like this.
the abortion rate has increased substantially.
Right, right,
No.
exactly,
So, like, all if they
exactly.
wanted to reduce abortions, like, that didn't happen, so yeah, and so that's an American argument here with all of our adversarial society, but this is not just America not having babies. We're still actually having more babies than a lot of other places, like Brazil's not having babies, Japan's not having babies, they've got a
Or you can
different
go through the
issue.
list. Yeah,
You know,
nobody's
there
having.
nobody's having babies, and so I don't know,
Right.
I mean, I can put a finger on a lot of our reasonings for having babies, and it could be, a lot of angst among young people generally, well, also because 'cause they're not having sex anywhere in the world, so, there's that.
Not as much,
But
no.
is that the reason why people aren't having babies in other parts of the world, or are there other do they have other structural issues or pressures that are causing them also not to wanna have babies? Because not having sex is one thing, but not wanting to have babies is a whole different thing.
Well, I mean, in Western, well, not even just Western countries. I mean, like in places like this is true in South Korea as well, where you have polling is showing a huge divide in terms of and tonally. We don't have to necessarily talk because we're talking about the whole world, and so you can say conservative, liberal, but that means something very, very different depending on which country you're in. But tonally, there's a big difference politically between men and women, young men and young women.
Yeah.
And so you just have young women around in different places who are just like, well, I don't know why I should have to deal with this. I have the choice. Why would I deal with this?
No,
You
and that's
know?
particularly true in South Korea. There's like this even
Yeah.
more stuff than here. There's this huge divide where the men are the very, very, and a lot of Asian countries are very male dominated, and they've got their whole last, I think it was their last president, was really taking away a lot of liberties for women, and the women are just like, "Pfft, okay, then yeah, like you're saying, why should I participate?
I mean,
And
I
that's
hear.
part here and part of it other places too. And the other part, there was a meme that was really interesting I saw that, like, the absurdity of telling women that they should stay home, raise children, take care of their family, and then blaming them when they can't be financially self-sustaining after a divorce.
Right.
Because, that's the reality in a lot of the world where you don't,
Mhm.
you can't always count on somebody else's income. And yet, and what young women have learned this, all over the place, that if you don't take care of yourself, like, you may not be in a situation where somebody's going to be able to take care of you. So you've
Mhm.
not only to have those things, the family and babies and things like that, but you need to be sure that you can have a career and an income at the same time, because otherwise you might just be living on the street and it'll be your fault.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is going back to the US, this seems pretty clear to me since it's clear to me that we've undergone a Christian national revolution. one of the things about that revolution that's sort of ironic in a sense is that the community that exercised that revolution, that implemented it, is a top-down community. That's the way it operates. It operates where, like the top tells everybody else what to do, and everybody else, that's what they want. And they just assume that, okay, if we can do that on a national scale, that everybody's just going to fall in line. But they're one of the few communities in the United States of America that is literally top down like that. Like the rest of the country isn't. It's like
Right. Yeah.
the rest of the country is
Yeah.
just kind of,
Yeah.
everybody's kind of doing their thing. And, people kind of, you might try to tell somebody to do something and they'll literally ignore you because they really don't feel threatened. It's like, who are you? I don't, it's like,
Yeah.
so I think that's
It's
one irony and one of the reasons why it's so hard, even within the country, but for outsiders to recognize that the US has undergone a revolution
mhm.
because the way that revolution is so atypical for the United States of America. But part of being top down is they all sing the same song.
Mhm.
They will all move in one direction at the
Right.
same time. Whereas everybody else is just sort of all over the place. And, you have no king's rallies. And if you look at the signs on the rallies, they're
Yeah.
saying all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas this top down revolutionary radical movement, they're all saying the same thing, you know? Uh, And I think that that's the reason why they managed to, cause so much damage to the country.
Yeah, well,
But
if you look at, the structural Christianity, it is hierarchical. I think that's one reason why it's become a political instrument because not so
true.
much in churches, modern day churches, but the Catholic Church and other churches, they are top-down organizations. They expect you, there's the God and there's the man, and then there's, the women, and then there's, depending on the man, there's, which kind of men are you, and all of this stuff. And then the new thing with the Southern Baptist Church, saying that women shouldn't have any voice and blah blah blah, and all this stuff, and women. But it's nice because you don't have to go to that church. You can be a woman and say, yeah, done,
Right,
taking
exactly.
my money elsewhere. I don't really care what you're going to be doing here. And I think that's kind of like how this might work for us is people will, and we've had this discussion before, we don't always agree, will kind of opt out that, or America being Americans for us will act out, which you do, like this this cage match or whatever this is that they're having on Sunday
Right.
or whatever day it is.
No, it's Sunday.
Is it Sunday? So I
Yeah.
had heard, I do not know if this is true, but I had heard that the people that there was a movement of like gay men, because it's Pride Month,
Hmm.
buying the tickets for this. So, to try to buy as many tickets as they could for this so that they could be gay men at these things.
I mean, it's a
And
it's a good idea, but the tickets are like $1 million each,
yeah, I
and
don't
they're
know if it was,
invitation
that's why I
only.
didn't know if it was true, but, Americans act out in a lot of different ways, which I
Yeah,
find
true.
soothing, and I think ultimately acting out enough and getting organized around acting out might change things, but or opting out, like, you don't have to go to the Southern Baptist Church, you can go somewhere else. You don't have to get married and have kids. So, if they're gonna create a structure of society where that's not comfortable, then you just make another choice or you go to another country if you well, as long as you can. But you can opt out of a lot of things. You can't opt out of everything, but you can opt out of a lot of things so that begins to create things different movement socially. So it might just be
Well,
a slow moving reaction.
yeah, and that's why I think that, the thing that you mentioned that is probably the most relevant to the conversation that we just had is with regard to work is the need to think in terms of community.
Mhm.
And that may be the thing that will save groups of people in different parts of the country if they could just sort of start thinking in terms of like literally in their neighborhood or in their town or whatever. Just start thinking, okay, well, that's what's happening nationally. Everything's screwed up, because I mean, it seems to me like people won't really realize what has happened until it's too late. But
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
whatever. But people will probably can kind of leverage the resources in their immediate vicinity together,
Yeah.
to
Hopefully.
at least mitigate
Yeah.
the disruption. I mean,
Yeah.
that's one thing that they can do. I'm
Well,
trying to
and
wrap up because it's like
oh
4:10.
god, we're past. Okay. Well, let me say one more thing around that because I think it triggered something that I think might be an interesting movement in the future. Like, with this disruption in oil and and in electricity, and we haven't really seen what the results are here yet.
Mm,
But you know, one of the community responses, and we've talked about this earlier, is to create kind of community grids versus central grids. And you can have lots of different kinds. Some places in the country could be geothermal, some can be
mhm.
hydroelectric, some could be
Yep.
solar, different things. But that is one way to disengage from that hierarchical structure. Because when you no longer have to worry about central electricity, which is really centralized power,
Mhm.
if you then you have a lot more autonomy as a community. So I do think there's a lot of value in community and that we might end up restructuring around communities as a way to respond to all of the pressures that are happening right now.
Yeah, I do agree with that because there already has been a movement to kind of build your own power plant. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I forget, it's been a while since I've read about that, but I mean, that's already been there. So you can build on top of that because
Yeah,
the places that had the issue in the past still will probably have the same issue now. So I agree with you. Decoupling from the main power grid. I mean, and so you can connect it and disconnect it when you want to as a
right.
community.
Yeah.
Because you might actually produce a surplus, and it might be something that could benefit your community selling that surplus. Like I think Toronto does that. But so yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. So yeah, I mean, I hope we stayed on topic. Actually, I have to admit,
We never
is
stay
usually
on topic. But we gotta wrap or we circle around it 4 or 5 times,
that is true. That is true. But we do this
Uh,
every 2 weeks, and we have no idea what we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks because we have no idea what's going to happen between now
I know lots of
and
things
2
can
weeks
happen
from
between
now.
now and then. We have a
Yeah,
cage
a lot
fight
of stuff
between
can
now and
happen.
then, so that might be fun.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But thank you for listening, and check us out in 2 weeks.
All right. Bye.